Okay, great. So this meeting will be recorded and we'll share it with you all once we're able to convert it into a usable link. But again, my name is Chloe Hundalt with NACD. I'm the grant specialist for this program and for all of our grants programs. So thank you all so much for joining us to learn more about the perimeter fencing for feral swine grant opportunity. And I'm going to pass it over to our CEO, Jeremy Peters, who is happy to give you a welcome and say a few words.
Yeah, thank you, Chloe, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. Really pleased to be having the webinar today to discuss more and share some additional information on the perimeter fencing for feral swine grant opportunity that NACD is making available this year. Got a note here that you can't hear me. Is that better? Chloe, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's a little quiet. I just had to turn up my volume, but it's all right for me.
Yeah, please, if you're having trouble hearing, adjust your volume. I'll speak a little bit louder. But my name is Jeremy Peters. I'm NACD's Chief Executive Officer. Really pleased to be able to have an opportunity to talk today about NACD's perimeter fencing for feral swine grant opportunity. It's a grant program that we're making available in partnership with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and a little bit of background with the program and how we came into offering this opportunity. One, I would share feral swine and invasive species generally is one of the pretty universal resource concerns that we hear about constantly and pretty consistently from a lot of parts of the country. So there has been a lot more emphasis from a policy standpoint in terms of looking for solutions and ways of being able to more effectively manage and control feral swine populations. One of the things that came about within the last year was a congressional earmark on conservation technical assistance funding through the appropriations cycle. And so that earmark created a set aside amount of funding that's available for perimeter fencing initiatives. And so NRCS and NACD saw an opportunity here to be able to put this program out for conservation districts and our partners to participate in. So we're really putting an emphasis on cost share for practices to be able to get perimeter fencing installed in places where feral swine are a risk, where they're demonstrating impact to producers and to the natural resources, or where there's a risk of feral swine being introduced into communities and having a similar impact. A lot of different ways that we're evaluating the program. It's a nationwide program, of course, but we also want to make sure that the areas in which the funding are going to be implemented for practices, that there is a priority and an impact from feral swine that's occurring. And there's several ways that we can look at that through maps that are available from APHIS or other documentation that can be provided to be able to demonstrate the resource concern that's present. Really recognizing that perimeter fencing isn't a single solution in and of itself. Like many resource concerns, there are multiple practices and approaches that can be beneficial in terms of addressing the resource concern. But one that we've heard, again, pretty consistently is the need for greater resources for perimeter fencing as one control among several. We know, there's migratory patterns with swine. They tend to move around a lot and into differing communities. That's one of the challenges with controlling feral swine impact. So we're really interested in seeing how this fits into more comprehensive strategies as one tool among many that can be useful. And so not only interested in the practice application itself, but also learning from the practice application and understanding how we can be most effective in controlling this invasive species, minimizing impact to producers, to the natural resources, and learning as we go. As I mentioned, nationwide program, but there are, some specific geographies where we know that feral swine is having an immediate impact, a severe impact, and that's demonstrated on the map that's currently on the screen here. So again, from NACD's standpoint, very pleased to be able to offer this opportunity and look forward to working in partnership with our members and with many others that will play a role in successful implementation. So many thanks to Chloe, to Meg Leader, and all of our staff team that have worked to bring us to this point, and looking forward to a good, robust proposal application process and getting the work underway. So Chloe, I'll turn things back to you, and I look forward to the rest of the webinar.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Jeremy. And I think that I'm going to be passing it over to Jen or Meg.
I'm picking it up. Thanks, Chloe. Thanks,
Okay.
Jeremy. Hello, everybody. I am Meg Leader, the Director of Conservation Programs, and my team is excited with this new opportunity. It also expands some of the work that NACD is doing for you, the districts. So this opportunity is going to have $7.5 million available for pass-through grants for you to apply to. As Jeremy indicated, the bulk of this funding is intended to be used for financial assistance, cost share, to actually get fences in the ground built so that the feral hog population is restricted and kept out of productive land. That said, there are no guidelines on what your minimum or maximum requests can be. We do ask within the application approximately how many feet of fence you expect to have installed through the life of the grant. So we are looking for the proposals to be cost effective is our concern, more than setting maximum or minimum. The bulk of the funding is meant to be used for financial support, but we are aware that in order to get any kind of practices on the ground takes outreach and technical assistance from you, the districts that will be applying. And so there is room in the funding for some supporting funding in terms of outreach and technical support, but the bulk of it is meant to be spent for the cost share, the financial assistance going out to your producers. For the funding that is not being used for financial support, so the outreach and technical assistance funding, there is a 10% non-federal match requirement. And just to make sure it's very clear here, this is not the producer's share of the financial assistance to get the projects on the ground. This is not to be meant to be fulfilled by anything the producers are doing. This is meant to be from your resources, and in kind is acceptable for meeting the match requirement. The timeline for these projects is within 2 years, and that is from when the awards are originally made to closing the project, which means the fences are built and the producers have received their funding. Slide, please, Chloe. So who's eligible to apply? The eligible applicants is intended to be the local conservation districts, the local staff that's on the ground working side by side with their producers to help support that, because we do know that in some areas, because of just management styles and everything else, the running the funding through the applicant of a state association or a state Department of Ag, state agency, is acceptable, as long as it's clear that the focus is spending the money on that local level, getting the financial assistance with one-on-one technical assistance out to the producers. In addition to that, the lead applicants are welcome to be RC&D councils as well as Indian tribal governments. One thing to keep in mind is these are your lead applicants. Part of making sure that we are reaching out to strengthening connections and partnerships with underserved producers and producer groups is certainly encouraged. And in fact, when you are completing the application in the project narrative, one of the questions will ask about your strategy of reaching historically underserved producers, and will give you a chance to include some of those partnerships and who they are. So please encourage development of some of those connections to help get the outreach out and ensure that we are reaching all of the producers within your communities. Slide, please, Chloe. So with the primary focus of this funding being on cost share, on financial assistance, we have set up two different ways that the financial assistance can be handled within your district. Track one is for those areas where you have an existing cost share program for building perimeter fencing for feral hogs. These are not federal programs, these are local programs, whether it's run through your state, through another local organization or your conservation districts, through an NGO, through a tribe. And when you're on this track for handling cost shares, this program is set up so that we cede precedence. We take the back seat and we allow that existing program, because we're thinking of you as the districts, and the last thing you're going to want to do is be saying, okay, which program is funding this? Which form do I need? Do I need that form? Do I need this form? Rather than having that level of paperwork confusion, if you are augmenting an existing program so that these two programs are working side by side, rather than having two sets of guidelines and paperwork, we will see precedence, and we will allow whatever your existing local program is. So when it comes to determining eligibility, when it comes to environmental evaluations, when it comes to contracting and payment scenarios, all of that will be controlled by your local program to help keep consistency across it for your local staff. The one thing we do have to insist, if you're on this track, because this is federal funds, the participating producers will still need to have a farm and track number for the fields where the fencing is going. But in terms of the other documentations, we will allow you to use your existing program. The idea here is that by having the two programs working together, they can augment each other and be able to create an even larger footprint than having them working separately or not being used in the same area. For anyone that's interested in applying for the funds that doesn't have an existing program to be running through, then we have established our own program structure, which is the second track, the right-hand column, as you see here. So if you don't have an existing program, then we would encourage you then to be using our program structure that I'll get into in a few minutes. We've got a nice little checklist to work down through. And for this program, we are following NRCS's practice standards and payment scenarios in terms of what the payment ratios are for historically underserved producers or for non-historically underserved producers. If we're using this system, then we have set up a 3-party contract. And so your producer contract will be signed by NACD, by you as the local grant holder, and then the producer themselves, to make sure that all parties are in agreement and a clear understanding of what the project is installing. Chloe, if you can give me the next slide, appreciate it. So with our program structure, as I said, this is if you do not have a local cost share program for fencing to draw on, you would be using our system. The first step of it would be a farm and track number. And if your producers that are receiving this funding do not have their own farm and track numbers already, your responsibility would be to assist them getting those farm and track numbers. And Lutrina in a minute, we'll get into a little bit more detail about that process. The next step that you would be responsible for would be following our policies and guidelines. You would need to sorry about that. We were muting someone else's mic and I got muted. So the next step in the checklist would be to determine the producer eligibility for program participation. We have our own policies with a, say, EQIP program. Normally NRCS would pass this off to the FSA office. Because this is not an EQIP program, this is an NACD program. One of your responsibilities would be to help them pull together the eligibility paperwork according to our policies. The third point on the checklist is the environmental evaluation. The need for whether that is going to be required, we are using the CPA-52, a federal form for it, is being determined by the state office on a state-by-state or territory level. And so this would be a conversation you would need to have when you enter the grant with your state leadership or your local NRCS DC to make sure that there is a clear understanding of whether your state is going to require an environmental evaluation for perimeter fencing. The next, of course, once you've gotten the initial paperwork out of the way, is the practice itself. This funding is to be used for EQIP practice number 382. That is the purpose of this funding. And if you aren't familiar with that practice funding, I would send you to the field office technical guide. The electronic version, of course, is the easiest way to access it. And those guidelines do vary by state. So make sure when you are looking at it that you are pulling up the practice standards for your state or territory. Assuming the practice is decided to be done, the producer will then enter into that three-way contract that I've already specified on the earlier slide. And with that contract will be a schedule of operations. So everyone is clear about who is doing what and when. This funding does not require a conservation plan, which is part of the normal NRCS process. But for this funding, we are not requiring a conservation plan. You, the recipient of this grant funding, are then responsible for the design of the fence, as well as overseeing the implementation and confirming that it was put in up to the right standard. This responsibility, we realize not all district offices are able to handle, and so you can build into your contracts or your grant proposals, sorry, to have a contractor who will be paid for doing this service. That is certainly an acceptable expense for this program. And then the last step of the checklist, of course, is the payments. And we are set up to either, if you have the infrastructure as the grant recipient and want to administer the payments, we can certainly allow you to do that. You can also request that NACD distributes the payments out and step out of that responsibility. As I said, it's a checklist that should be fairly straightforward, particularly once you get started on the system. And with that, I am going to hand it off to Latrina to talk in a little bit more detail on some of those aspects. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you. So since this is a cost share program, all producers participating must have a farm and track number, and that is provided by FSA, that's the Farm Service Agency. A farm and track number is usually a producer's first contact with FSA when they visit the USDA Service Center. This farm and track number is required by USDA. This is a way that they track benefits and ensure that there's no duplicate payments being made. And so the following documents are needed for a farm and track number, and that would be proof of identity. That's a driver's license or passport, customer data worksheet for new producers, highly erodible land conservation and wetland conservation certification, proof of land control, and socially disadvantaged limited resource beginning and veteran farmers or rancher certification. And those forms are actually something that a producer will fill out when they go to the USDA Service Center office to get, enrolled in various programs, but these are what is required. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, now in the event that a producer does not have a farm and tract number, it is a responsibility of the recipient to provide support to the producer in obtaining that farm and tract number. And so what does that support look like? Well, we want you to make sure that you go with the producer to the office, make sure that producer has all of their, the paperwork I mentioned earlier, their identification, and other paperwork that's needed, and make sure that the process, everything goes through its process, and ultimately that producer gets a farm and tract number. We would hope that you would follow the paperwork as it goes through, maybe contact the FSA representative to make sure that they have everything that they need in order to process that paperwork. We understand in certain situations, there may be some producers might have difficulty in getting these numbers. So we provided some training. I don't know how many of you were able to view the training on Monday with FSA, but it is on our YouTube channel. And so there's timestamps on each part of that webinar. So the part about farm and tract number, it goes really in depth. So you can go on there and view that and get that training that you need. And if you have any other questions, of course, you can email us at any time. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so if a recipient is using the funding to augment an existing state, local, tribal, or private program, the producer must demonstrate certain things. So they must demonstrate a landowner a concurrence document of U.S. citizenship if applying as an individual, and U.S. ownership and control if applying as an entity. And I just wanted to note that there are certain forms that are you normally have to have for EQIP and CSP, and that's the adjusted gross income. It's the CCC 941, the farm operating plan form for individual and for entity, that's the CCC 901, and then that for this program. So just want to reiterate that those forms.
I'm afraid Latrina's breaking up a little bit. She'll be back with us in a moment.
Hello, can you all hear me?
We can now. You broke up for a minute. Are you still with us?
Well,
I
am
I back okay?
Oh, now she's
yes,
back.
we've got you back, Latrina.
Okay, I don't know where I stopped off.
You were
You were
discussing the
naming
different
the
forms.
different forms that aren't required.
So this is Jen. I think while Lutrina is having some technical difficulties, I'll just maybe fill in for her for a moment. Essentially, the bottom line is that when it comes to the perimeter fencing cost share program, FSA is not conducting the eligibility determinations in this case, and that's a departure from the usual process where they do conduct eligibility determinations for participation in Farm Bill programs. While we see this for the perimeter fencing grant, you'll also see it for NACD's Climate Smart Commodities grant. So what Lutrina was just sharing is some of the forms that are typically required for determinations, such as, documenting AGI, the CCC 901s and 2s. Those are not required this time around. So we've been working, and particularly Dr. Staley has been working with FSA just to make sure that we are communicating that with them and there isn't confusion at the local office. But we are hoping to share this more broadly with you all as well, just in case there might be some confusion if messages aren't being reached by the local FSA office. It's important for you all to know that the full determination process is not required in this situation. So Dr. Staley, I'm not sure if you're back on and if you had anything else to add. Otherwise, we might want to continue to the next slide.
Thank you, Jen. Go ahead, Chloe.
Yeah, sorry, I will unmute myself. So I'm going to just take a moment to discuss the grant application process to wrap up the presentation. I did forget to mention that we'll cover questions at the end. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can wait to ask them at the end of the presentation. So our applications will need to be submitted through the online portal, which is a FormStack link. You can find that on the program homepage, which I'll go over in the next slide. So all applications have to be submitted through that online application portal, and that will be due on October 13th. A couple other resources that will be available on the program website is an application preview document. So that's a document that lists all of the questions that you'll find when you go into the online portal. And so that way, if you'd like to take the time to review the questions, maybe write out your answers in a Word document, so then you can just copy and paste them into the online portal. Some applicants find that useful. And that way, if there's ever any technical issues with the online portal, none of your information is lost. That rarely happens, but sometimes it's good to write it out first, and you can use spell check when you're in a Word document as well. We'll also have a budget worksheet that's required that you can document, or I'm sorry, that you can download on the program homepage. And we'll be announcing the awards in December. Just so you're aware of the general timeline, there's a little bit more detailed timeline available in the RFA. So this is just a preview of the homepage. If you're trying to find the homepage on our website, you'll just go to the What We Do tab, and then there is a link for the perimeter fencing program. So you can see the buttons here where you can review the full request for applications, the link to submit the application, which takes you to FormStack, the application preview, which I had discussed for you to review the questions before you enter the online portal. And then you can also download the budget worksheet from the website, but there's also a link to download the budget worksheet through the online portal. So whichever way makes more sense for you. This is just a quick preview of the application preview template. So this is what it looks like when you download it, and then you're able to kind of look through the questions and get a better idea of what will be asked when you enter into the online portal. This is a preview of the FormStack application. So that's what you'll see when you enter the online portal. Just a reminder, the applications are due through this portal by October 13th. That's a Friday, and they have to be submitted before midnight, so 11:59 p.m. This is the budget worksheet that you can download through the website or through FormStack. It's somewhat straightforward with the capacity building costs, but there's a unique addition for this program, which is the financial assistance piece. So you'll have to indicate the amount of funding that you're requesting from NACD for cost share for producers. You'll also have to indicate the anticipated funding from other cost share programs as part of your cash match or in-kind match. And then you'll also have to indicate an anticipated total linear feet of fencing funded with this program. So beyond just the numbers for the budget, you'll have to add one metric to this budget template. I also wanted to make a note about indirect costs for this program, so I'm going to get into that. So this is kind of a big, long slide. We will be sharing these slides also on the website and following up with anybody who registered for the webinar. So you'll have access to this information, but there's also a link to read the full guidance for indirect costs in the budget in the RFA. So if you look in the RFA, you should find it. If you have any trouble finding it, I'm happy to share it with you as well. So we allow for indirect costs in 3 different scenarios. The first one is that you don't take any indirect costs, so your budget is 100% direct cost. It's important to note that certain administrative costs can be considered direct costs under personnel. So if the staff person is working on administering the grant program, and so those activities are indispensable to completing the outcomes of your project, then that would be considered a direct cost. So sometimes there's confusion about indirect versus administrative. If the administrative work is specifically to complete this grant program, then that is considered a direct cost and not an indirect cost. If you have any questions about your specific budget, just let me know. I might sound like a broken record on that, but I'm happy to talk it through with people. So the second scenario is that you apply for the 10% de minimis rate, and that would be applied to your total modified direct costs, which doesn't necessarily include all your direct costs. There's more information on that in the full indirect cost policy. But there's certain costs that can't be included as part of that total base rate. So you would take 10% out of that rate. And you'll also be required to submit your financial or accounting policies to make it clear that you have a outline policy for your cost allocation process, just to ensure that costs aren't double charged as direct and indirect at the same time. So just knowing that you're categorizing the costs internally. We reserve the right to review those policies as well and ask you questions just to make sure that the funds are being spent how you're indicating them in your application. So there's a little bit more information about the policies that we would look for your internal financial policies. So that includes accounting records that identify the receipt of your funds under each of your grant and the expenditures that you're using those funds for. And then also that it or it includes a adequate internal control. I'm sorry, in addition, including an adequate internal control, this isn't an or, my apologies, to preclude your incurring any obligations in excess of your total funds. So having some form of internal controls to ensure that you're not spending more money than you said you would in a certain budget category. If you do have changes to your budget throughout your grant period, you can always reach out to us to request an amendment, but that's something that we would have to review. So you don't want to spend the money before we know what you're spending it on. And then the last scenario, and I know I'm getting really in the weeds here, but I wanted to just highlight this since our policy has changed recently. You can use your NICRA, that's your negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. So the rate that's established in your NICRA, which is a agreement that you would have established with your cognizant federal agency. So if you have a NICRA and you want to use that rate, you would have to submit that documentation to us. So lastly, I'll just briefly cover the evaluation criteria. So the applications will be evaluated based on the following. First is the estimated density of feral swine that's within your area of the project. That's 40%. The strength and clarity of your strategy for conducting outreach, 25%. The impact your project will have on tribal and historically underserved producers and community is 25%. That's also very unique to each individual community. So it depends on the makeup of your community. The cost effectiveness of your budget. So the reason that we asked how many linear feet of fencing will be installed so that we can determine how much basically per foot for a budget, but that's only weighted 5%. And then your past performance with NACD grants, if that's applicable. So if you haven't had a grant with us before, that's not going to be a disadvantage to you. If you've had a grant previously, then we might look at the performance throughout that grant in terms of submitting your reports in a timely fashion and things of that nature. That would be weighted 5% if it's applicable. So with all that being said, I can open it up to some questions. I see we got a couple in the chat. Perhaps. It looks like we have some. Okay,
Thank you,
so yeah,
Chloe.
do you want to take it over, Meg?
Go ahead.
Okay, I just saw here there was one question about if money can be used for traps or only for fencing. So it can only be used for fencing. It can only be used for that one practice, the 382. There was a question also that was answered in the chat, but I can open it up just so that everyone else is able to see it or hear it. So where are perimeter fencing programs already in place? What types of producers tend to use perimeter fencing for hog control? For example, small specialty crop growers versus 1,000 acre commodity farmers. What is the cost share rate per foot of fence? So Jen did answer that in the chat. She said, we're not aware of all the state and local, tribal or private programs that are already in place, but we do know that some do exist in various pockets of the US and are already funded by grants. And I think Wes provided some resources for South Carolina specifically in the chat, if anyone's looking for that. And the types of producers that utilize perimeter fencing vary. It can be to protect crops. It could also be to protect livestock. And that tends to be more geographically based. And let's see, one other question I have here is, does NACD need proof of job approval authority for fencing? And I do not have the answer to that one.
Jen just answered it. She will follow up on it. If you're leveraging an existing cost share program, there will be specific requirements for checkout and approval. We'll follow up to confirm the response for the NACD program structure. Thanks, Jen.
Great. So yeah, if anyone else has any other questions, you can either pop them in the chat or at this point, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
The team's joint email address is there on the screen. So as you are putting together your proposals, if you should have any questions, rather than worrying about which one of us you need to be asking, please use the general team email address. We would be happy to answer your question by email or get on a quick phone call and be able to have a discussion with you. If we don't have an answer, we will certainly get back to you. Looks like we've got one more follow-up question. Are all types of 382 fencing allowed? That is determined by your state standards. So you need to go into your state field office technical guide and follow their instructions in terms of what types of fencing is allowed. Are there any considered more effective for swine control? Yeah, Jen answered, only the ones that are strong enough to mitigate the impacts. Does a local program's fencing requirement supersede 382 if more stringent or using mixed fencing types? You can certainly, I believe, be more stringent, but how that affects the payment schedule, I will need to look into.
A couple of people saying net wire is effective. Yeah.
This is a new program for NACD, so we are committed to finding an answer for you, but we may not have the answers right off the tip of our tongues. So, well, thank you everyone that joined us today. We appreciate your time and hope you will look further into this. This seems like a very great opportunity, and we appreciate your attention to it.